Welcome to the National Security Alert, brought to you by the Citizens Commission on National Security. Now here's your host, Roger Aronoff.
Thank you, Don. I want to welcome everyone to this week's episode of the National Security Alert. And I have a great guest today to really cover so many of the issues going on in the world today. And we'll get some great history. And the person I'm talking about is really, in my opinion, one of the great journalists of the last 40 years. Her name is Claudia Rosett. I'm sure most of you are familiar with her, but to just give you a little background, she was mostly with the Wall Street Journal. She was Moscow bureau chief. She was at Tiananmen Square. She won awards for her reporting there at Tiananmen Square. She reported on the corruption at the UN, which broke a lot of ground and really put her on the map, I believe. She reported on the labor camps in North Korea. She was on the board, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal for years. And I want to certainly ask her about that because for myself, and I'm sure a lot of other people, we always turn to that editorial page, Robert Bartley, Wall Street Journal, first thing, to just get great perspective on what's going on. But so there's much more, and we'll get into that. But let's bring on our guest, Claudia Rosett. Claudia, welcome to the National Security Alert. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, well, there's a couple big stories just this week that I want to start with. But even before that, tell me when you were coming through Yale and Columbia, what were your dreams and your aspirations as far as becoming a journalist? And could you ever have imagined you would see all the things that you saw and do all the things that you did?
I actually never aspired to be a journalist, nor did I study journalism. I loved poetry and I loved travel, and I find human nature interesting, and that led me into what became a career in journalism. So I never really expected that. Pardon me, I'm going to get a cat off my desk. It's a personal element. Okay. But I never really sought to go into journalism. It happened because it was a way to travel to places I really wanted to go to talk with people. It's an incredible license to speak with people who otherwise really wouldn't have time to talk with you. And I find interesting to this day, it's useful to have some background in both literature and economics, which is what I did study, for reporting on the world. Because it's both, how do human beings behave? Human nature is pretty consistent across the centuries, and economics will tell you a lot about their incentives and how they respond to that. So that's really, it's been fascinating. There are things I would not have traded away for the world. And at the same time, some of it has just been haunting, poignant, and I'm extremely worried about the trajectory of America and the world today. We've seen better times.
We will get into that. Tell me about your experience. I know for years you were a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, but right now tell about the period where you were on the editorial board and with Robert Bartley, as I was saying in the introduction, what an iconic figure he was for so many of us who would always turn to the Wall Street Journal editorial page as opposed to the front page every day.
Yeah, I thought he was the best editor in the world. It was a huge privilege working for him. Let's see, I worked for him at the Journal. I had a sort of odd career in the sense that I initially went to work for Bob Bartley. I worked for him in New York, then went to, under his leadership, to be the editorial page editor of what was then the print edition of the Asian Wall Street Journal, covering Asia, based out of Hong Kong. Then went to the news side, which is a direction people typically don't go at the Journal, from editorial to news, but I did. in the 90s and worked in the for the foreign desk at their news bureau in Moscow, where I was first a reporter, then the bureau chief. I learned a lot about corruption in Russia. It was a great tutorial in how these things work. Good preparation for reporting later on the UN. I came back to the US in 1997. Bob Bartley called me. In fact, he called me. I was in Hong Kong for the 1997 handover from Britain to China and got a phone call from Bob, who tracked me down to the Foreign Correspondents Club, saying, I'd like you to come back and work for me in New York. Because there's this little crisis that's going on in Thailand with the Thai currency, the baht. I said, the baht? Well, Bob was pressy and he was very good. It turned out to be right. That was the beginning of what was then a big crisis in world currency markets. And I came back to New York, joined the editorial board in New York, and then through 2002, wrote editorials. When I came back, the immediate urgency was world financial markets. And I wrote a lot about that, about the International Monetary Fund. It was an interesting time. It was under President Clinton. Well, they're all interesting times. But that was sort of mostly financial, economic news. In the end, I really wanted to get back to a sort of more broad-ranging interest in, frankly, dictatorships and the dissidents who defy them. That's always fascinated me. I left the Wall Street Journal at the end of 2002, at which point Bob had retired. I still respect the Journal. I write for them occasionally. I sort of like, so they have some wonderful people there, but I've been freelance since then. And it's been an interesting ride.
Yeah, I would say so. I know you've spent a number of years as a journalist in residence with Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Cliff May's group, which is great. And today you're with the Independent Women's Forum. Can you tell us a little about IWF and what's going on over there? And then we'll start hitting the topics.
Sure. IWF is basically about freedom and free markets, and they're focused mainly, their chief focus is domestic issues, but they also have an interest in foreign policy. They brought me in some years ago now, back in 2016, and I've been working with them ever since. They're a terrific group of women, and they're basically, they say all issues are women's issues on foreign policy. It's certainly the case. It doesn't really fall neatly out into women and men or other. It's about the security of our country, the defense of freedom, the fate of the world. And it's a pleasure working with them. You can find them at iwf.org. And they address many, many topics. And as you might imagine, in the current climate, they have a lot to say. So it's a great outfit. I recommend visiting the website. Please do. And I'm one of their foreign policy people.
Right, I agree. I get their notices every day, and it is a wonderful organization and website. So let's hit a couple of the first two big things that have gone on this week. We'll start with Gorbachev, who passed away. And I know you were the Moscow chief reporter for the Journal in, I think, 93 to 96 or 94, somewhere in that range. Okay. And so the one question that I think people are wondering this week is, I mean, he's given a lot of credit for ending the Soviet Empire, and I think deserves it. But the question is, how much does Reagan deserve versus how much does Gorbachev deserve? And any kind of personal encounters you had with Gorbachev would be interesting too.
Yeah, well, I interviewed him when I was working in Moscow. Everybody did. He was sort of available. The Soviet Union had collapsed. And my God, that man could talk for a long time. It's a sort of reasonable tradition that we say largely nice things about the most recently dead. So with that understanding, I have three heroes of the Soviet collapse. Above all, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Boris Yeltsin. who, for all his faults, really, he was the guy, remember, with the coup attempt in the summer of 91, that was sort of the real earthquake just before the collapse at Christmas. He was the one who climbed on top of the tank. It wasn't Gorbachev. It was, and he was the one who then unpinned the Soviet Union. It wasn't Gorbachev. It was Yeltsin who walked in and informed Gorbachev on Christmas Day, "It's over. You know, you're president, but of nothing, or you're the top guy." And with Gorbachev, he could have been worse. He could have been much worse, but he was not trying to orchestrate what finally happened with the end, sort of the end at that stage of the Cold War. He was trying to keep the Soviet Union together, and it was still quite a violent, brutal system. Remember, the firing, the attempt to stop Lithuania, where they went in and fired at the TV tower, the people who died in Georgia. It wasn't as if this was just all some great smooth transition where a fine, benevolent, far-seeing leader came to power at the Kremlin. Gorbachev, I think, was more swept along on a tide that he tried to surf, but he really didn't have a lot of ability to steer or do anything else. And in the end, he was swept out again. Symbolically, it's so interesting, on Christmas Day, 1991. And he went on to do things that I actually think have done a certain amount of harm. The sort of Green Alliance with Al Gore and the whole climate thing in which he was a part, I do not think that has done great favors for world development, for sanity in some of the global debates. I think we're paying a price for that kind of thing right now. Let's assume the best possible intent, but in the pantheon of great statesmen, he was a man in a very interesting place at a very critical time, but I don't think he drove it.
One thing I found interesting that I didn't recall reading about him this week was when he ran for president again in '96, and he got 1% of the vote in Russia, which
Yeah.
I found
Well,
that.
now that's sort of the Russian elections, when they were having somewhat more normal elections before Vladimir Putin turned it all into a complete farce, had very interesting elements. I mean, Russians didn't like him. In the West, as you've probably heard, he's sort of revered as this hero. The State Department put out a press release upon his death that I thought was actually very badly worked out. They talked simply about Mikhail Gorbachev, who established trust and ended the Cold War. No, he was negotiating with President Ronald Reagan, whose motto was trust but verify, for a reason. And trust is greatly overrated when you have a system dealing with dictatorships. Trust is vital to the functioning of a free society. But when you get to a system in which there are really no rules that will enforce things except force, trust can be very misleading. And I think the State Department implied that Gorbachev was and I think they were right in this, he was of much the same mind as a lot of the talk you now hear coming out of the Biden administration. We'll find off-ramps, we'll discuss, we'll communicate. If we just communicate better. There are some things in this world, and foreign policy really is full of them when you get to predatory dictatorships, where actually you can understand each other very, very well. The problem is a profound difference. You want different things. So that's anyway, back to Russian elections. A lot of Russians didn't like him because he uncoupled the Soviet Union. They were miserable in many ways, but they were one of the great power opposing the U.S. There were a lot of Russians who came to wish that back. They wanted that power. They also wanted toilet paper and bread, but people always want to have both. And there was one very amusing election in Russia in '96. I think it was '96. The then mayor of Moscow, ran for re-election, Yuri Lushkov. He ran where, in order to have an opposing candidate, he had to back somebody to run against him. And he still won with something like 90% of the vote. And I went out thinking to interview people in Moscow, thinking this must be rigged. It has to be. I discovered to my surprise that a lot of them really liked him. They liked him for a very simple reason. He actually was fixing roads and picking up the trash. I mean, it was that basic. They hadn't had that kind of service. People died when they opposed him. I mean, there were sort of horrible assassinations going on at that point, as there still are. But that was the basis of his great popularity in Moscow, and there was actually something to it. So, yeah, Mikhail Gorbachev, hero in the West, but I think if you want a hero, look to Ronald Reagan.
Exactly, and that's a big part of why the media and everyone played him up so much. They wanted to give him all the credit, not Reagan, because how they viewed Reagan. So let's move on to the other big story of this week, which is the 1-year anniversary of our disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And there's so much we could talk about this, but let me frame it this way. Trump in February February of 2020 had signed the Doha agreement with the Taliban. And it just was the two parties, the U.S. and the Taliban. And this was the goal was to withdraw our troops by May, but it was condition based. And yet Biden, when he did the withdrawal in August of last year, claimed, he had no choice. It was either that or send in another 100,000 troops. But I mean, just the way that unfolded was so horrible and shocking, in that we were there and not even bringing in Americans and the Afghans who had been so loyal to us, and let them be, and gave the list to the Afghans, to the Taliban, to decide who could come in. And so why don't you take it from there? Give us your impressions 1 year later.
It was catastrophic. We're paying the price, and we will continue to pay, I think, a rising price for it. There's a very good report out from the minority staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Representative McCall put out a report you can find on their site. It is worth reading. It's more than 100 pages, and it just goes through the mistakes, the lies, the misleading problems, the things that were bungled. It's a staggering list. But basically, President Biden misled, I think that's the polite verb for it, at every turn on this. He wasn't bound by what President Trump had left him. That was exactly as you said, conditioned on the Taliban fulfilling certain things. They were already in violation of it. And President Biden could have thrown the whole thing out and done something else. But what he did was, he said he blamed it on President Trump as if he were stuck with it, which was not true. And then he went ahead without any conditions and just announced it was all about optics. He wanted to be out of there by September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the horrible terrorist attack, the Al-Qaeda attacks in America in 2001. And everything became driven by that. And you'll recall, it was just this cascade of lies. They were lies. Let's call it what it is. He said, we don't need to worry about any repeat of the kind of scenes we saw at the fall of Saigon, that, things are going to be fine. He described how everything was under control. It was all great. Meantime, the Taliban were just sort of rolling up Afghanistan. And President Biden wasn't, he was not really reachable on the day that Kabul fell. This evacuation is he orders in troops not to, there's so many things. The list is long. But walking out of Bagram, our very important base there, in the middle of the night, without notifying our allies, apparently, who were sort of shocked what's going on with that, or the Afghans, we gave up an important base near China, which is the really big threat at this point, and in Central Asia. And over the horizon capabilities, we were told that's fine, it'll all work. No, they don't begin to compensate for that. the abandonment of the Afghans, especially Afghan women who had been encouraged to join the modern world and are now back in medieval hell, basically. The promise by President Biden and his crew that they will leave no Americans behind. They left hundreds, possibly much more than that. We've seen more than 800 now come out who wanted to get out. The number's probably way north of that. The Afghans basically betrayed and abandoned, that horrible scene of people dropping to their death from the wheel wells of an American cargo plane, sums up a lot. And I'll say our enemies, because I think Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping of China fall into that category. Our enemies watched this and learned from it. And the lesson was America will run from the Taliban. Imagine what they'll do if you're a nuclear armed power with a serious military. And that was that fall. Putin, who had already begun massing troops along the borders of Ukraine, begins this big buildup. And as American diplomats go running around looking for off-ramps, which I thought was really, forgive me if I call it entertaining. It's grim and serious. People are dying. But at some level, there's a comic aspect to it. Vladimir Putin is very good at finding his own off-ramps if he needs an off-ramp. It's not the job of the U.S. State Department to find one for him. Putin wasn't looking for an off-ramp. He was looking for when he was going to move on Ukraine. And that was obvious if you looked at what he was doing and the trajectory since he came to power on New Year's Eve in 1999. I mean, at the beginning of the millennium. It's a trajectory. He's following it, as is Xi Jinping. And Afghanistan was a point that said to them, go for broke. All these plans you have, you're a fool if you don't make a move. That's the invitation. Now we have this terrible, terrible thing where Al-Qaeda, which was never gone from Afghanistan, is back in there. When the Biden administration bragged up the drone strike that killed Ayman al-Zawahiri, Osama's former lieutenant, the leader of Al-Qaeda, when he died, he was living in Kabul. Well, he's not the only one. And if you look back at various, I think, credible reports, Al-Qaeda was never gone. Again, that was a lie. Right now, it's sort of off the radar. In fact, I don't think the White House put out any statement on the anniversary of the last soldier leaving. They've had proclamations on National Wilderness Month or something, but it was humiliating. It was a disaster for the U.S. It cost the lives of 13 servicemen and women during that hectic evacuation, which was, at the last minute, they decided, the powers that be in Washington decided to do something. It was bungled in just about every way you could bungle it. And now we have Putin normalizing open war in Europe, in Ukraine, in a friendly country. We have Xi Jinping walking toward what I am very worried is going to be the blockade and military seizure of Taiwan. And we have a world where I think no matter what people say officially, there's profound distrust of relying on the U.S. to back you. We sent the whole world a terrible signal when we ran from Afghanistan like that. That's the grim news there.
Yeah, it makes tonight's speech from Biden, the soul of the nation, a little ironic, because what you've just described, what their policies were. But you brought up Bagram, and everyone, the figure that we kept hearing was $85 billion worth of tanks, planes, artillery, drones, all this stuff that we just left there. And when you think about that in the context of Ukraine, we could have just moved that over to Ukraine if we were going to start helping them prepare for war against Russia. But just the shocking idea of the decision to leave that base with all that material in it. And this past weekend, I don't know if you saw General McKenzie, who was the general in charge in Afghanistan at the time, openly said, look, I advised to keep at least 2,500 people behind and did not think we should leave like we did at all. So, I mean, talk about that, Bagram, and the general's
Sure.
comments, if you heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, Bagram, long, quite a history. I saw Bagram in when Kabul was falling to what we then called the Mujahideen in the early 90s in Kabul or near Kabul. And the sort of evolution since. Did you know, I covered, when I was working on Russia, I went down to Crimea to cover some elections there, and there was a Soviet Afghan Veterans Club they called Bagram in Sevastopol. No, sorry, not Sevastopol, in Simferopol, in Crimea, which has now been seized by Russia from Ukraine, etc. They paid a lot of attention to what went on at Bagram, and we should have too. And when you say, yes, we should have shipped whatever the actual total of billions, I've seen different totals, upwards of 80 billion seems to be the figure worth of equipment that we just left. And it would have been better to dump it into the sea than leave it for the Taliban to take, but we left it. Would have been much better to ship it to Ukraine, would have been better to ship it to any of our allies who are increasingly threatened in various parts of the world. It was simply left. And I should have mentioned two other things about the retreat from ignominious retreat, unfortunately. I think America is a great nation. We deserve better, but this was ignominious. From Afghanistan. That was the incredibly demoralizing effect on the US military. People fought there, died there, suffered there. They gave so much. And then it was just all thrown away in that helter-skelter nothing. And then there's the question of what does happen there now. It's been a sort of chaotic, difficult period. People are now starving. Things are miserable. But there's China looking at the resources of Afghanistan. It's a conduit, potentially, for many things. It's a resource base. China is not at all as fastidious as the United States as far as trying to cultivate humanitarian causes, respect human rights, bring along. No, they're interested in simply plundering whatever they can and extending their reach. And do remember that while the U.S. was helicoptering staff from the embassy to that horrendous scene at the airport to be evacuated, the Chinese legation in Kabul was gloating that it was still open. So leaving Bagram, somebody else very likely will be using that to effect that will probably harm us in the end. We don't have it anymore. And remember the reports, assuming they were accurate, that when President Biden held a one-on-one summit with Vladimir Putin in Geneva in June of 2021, when everything was supposed to be okay over Ukraine, when Putin's backing down because the U.S. asked him to. One of the things that President Biden reportedly asked Putin was, could you help us get some base somewhere in Central Asia? And the answer was, if we leave. Basically, Putin has no interest in doing anything like that. That takes us to the Russia-China partnership, which maybe you want to get into in a separate section. But we have real problems that as the U.S. shows more and more weakness, which it's been doing at speed under the Biden administration, dictatorships with big ambitions are looking at the opportunities. It's quite a candy store. And they're making their moves, and more they're doing it together. That's dangerous. You don't want a rising axis of, they already have worked together for many, many years in many ways, but now we're seeing sort of a real rising axis of Russia, China, Iran, tack North Korea onto it, and then the sidekicks, Venezuela, Cuba. You can make a roster of the sort of third tier, but that's becoming quite dangerous.
Quite dangerous, to say the least. Yeah, and we'll come back to the Russia-Ukraine, but let's move to China. You brought that up, and of course these rare earth minerals in Afghanistan that we left behind for them. And
Yeah.
but so a couple of experiences or memories for you. I mean, you won awards for your reporting on Tiananmen Square. So take us back to that for a minute, and then we'll move up to Hong Kong and current days with basically the threat that China poses and how they've evolved here in the last 30, 40 years since you've been watching.
Yeah. Tiananmen was the most haunting story I've ever covered. It was a scene of so much courage and promise and heartbreak. Look, the people who, and I think it's misinterpreted in various ways. A lot of things in history are, but yes, I was there. I had a wonderful set of editors at the Wall Street Journal at the time. I was working out of Hong Kong. Seth Lipsky, who's now the editor of the New York Sun, was my immediate boss. Bob Bartley was my big boss back in New York. Seth was in Brussels, and he basically called me and he said, in the language of old black and white journalism, reporter movies, I'll paraphrase so it won't be vulgar, with Rosett, get your backside up to Beijing and don't come back till I tell you you can. Well, I'm a reporter. I was delighted to hear that. Up I went. And what was going on there was absolutely amazing at the time. This was the world's most populous communist state. And the people had actually taken control of their capital city, of Beijing. This was when Premier Li Peng had just declared martial law. And Beijing was a scene of demonstrations. And people were coming from around China to join them. And it went on until the night of June 3rd. They built that amazing Statue of Liberty. I watched them do it. I was talking with a young doctor, I wrote this up for the Journal at the time, we were sitting on the ground in Tiananmen watching them put together the statue, and came over in 3 pieces made of styrofoam and something else and concrete. I forget what went into it, but they had to piece it together. And I was talking with him about what he expected for China. And like so many, they wanted accountability from their government. They wanted the ability to weigh in as sort of voices of the people. They wanted democracy. They wanted the freedoms that we have enjoyed for so long in the West. They wanted those things. That's why they were building that statue. They certainly knew what it meant. And at the end, I said, as dawn broke, I said to him, I would love to talk with you again. Could I meet you later in the week? And he said, yeah. And I said, how about by this statue? And he said, and I think this reflects what people understood very well. He said, it might not be here. He said, more reliable if we meet by the statue, the portrait of Mao. And he pointed to the huge painting of Mao that hangs always over the gate to the Forbidden City at the north end of Tiananmen Square. Well, by that Saturday night, he was right. And I saw the whole thing play out in Tiananmen that night. I caught up with the Chinese army as they were shooting their way into Tiananmen Square just after midnight, a few miles west of the square. Watched them simply shooting into a crowd of people who had sticks and stones and Molotov cocktails trying to stop them. And then finally realized, of course, they're going to Tiananmen. That's where this showdown will be. That's where, as a reporter, you have to be. I turned and ran for Tiananmen. And to this day, I think I saw what unfolded there that night. I walked out with the demonstrators in the morning as the sun rose, and then had to find my way back past. They had captured a PLA soldier and beaten him to death near where I'd left my bike the night before. Got back to the hotel where I was staying, called my editor, Bob Bartley, back in New York, and dictated a story, and then went to write it up for the next day's paper. But I made sort of a rule for myself that I would report what I'd actually seen in the way of people shot. I spent half an hour in a rather dangerous place where the demonstrators had set up a sort of a hospital station at the north end of Tiananmen Square. And the troops were sort of sniping across the square at that point. I saw personally at that point 7 people carried in who had been shot. They weren't dead. I think one of them must have died soon after. He was shot in the gut. But at that point, I went to another part of the square where it was safer to watch from the side. So you can extrapolate. I saw what happened in the morning when many walked out. But I think the major killing went on in the streets around Tiananmen as they shot their way in, because that's where they were firing across the streets into the crowds, big crowds. And those crowds did not materialize in Tiananmen as the night went on. And in the morning, tanks blocked all that off. You couldn't get to that area. It was by Zhongnanhai, where the headquarters compound is of the Chinese Communist Party leadership, which has sort of enabled the Chinese government since then to say, oh, nothing big happened in Tiananmen. That is simply not true. I'm sure people died from the shooting that went on there. I think many more died in the streets around it that night. I don't think we will know the total, if ever, until the Communist Party finally falls, if we ever get access to the real records and can freely speak with people, try and correlate something, try and figure it out. But what certainly happened with that slaughter, and it was horrible, was you had a movement in China that was demanding reasonable rights, the rights of human beings, and they simply crushed it. They killed enough people. They then went around arresting enough people. And executing more on television. They threw them in prison. People fled into exile, and they shut it down. And they have made sure ever since that nothing like that can flare up again. I love the photo of, we all do, I think, that brave man in front of the tank, that single individual standing up to the column of tanks, so the tanks stop. There is one thing about it, though, that always I pause over, and that is, that's not actually how it played out. That's the ideal. Okay. In that case, the tank stopped. We know that the man has been disappeared. I doubt that the man who stopped the tank has had a good life since. That's the scene you want to see. But in truth, the man is gone. The tanks actually, except in that case, rolled on. And China has been crushed by that, effectively, column of tanks ever since. You don't see that. Yes, there are big protests have gone on in China. They're invariably shut down. People stand up and speak out. They go to prison or they end up in exile. There's a horrendous degree of control, and I think maybe it underscores something I would relate back to Gorbachev, and that is, there's a fair bit of evidence by now that communism does not actually reform. Jeane Kirkpatrick's old distinctions probably still hold, that you get dictatorships, Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan, which can evolve into, there's latitude there. There's not so much control that they can't transform into, for instance, the democracy that you now see on Taiwan. People on Taiwan did that themselves, abandoned as they were, basically, by the US in any official capacity. And I think one of the lessons there is communism, when we were looking for China to, reform by degrees, you would hear, oh, China's reforming. And I always thought, if this is where China was, say, in 89, Tiananmen, and this is some sort of free society and democracy, for years we would read about China's reforms, and it sounded as if, I put democracy over here, as if they were sort of moving well along that spectrum. In truth, no, it was that. They had changed economically, but politically, there was ferocious control, and we're seeing it becoming much more ferocious under Xi Jinping. So maybe an important thing to consider is that communism is more binary. It either collapses, which is what happened when Ronald Reagan really stood up to it in the 80s, or it carries on, which is what's happened in China, where it's increasingly sort of developing into something both very malign and competent to attack us, subvert us, attack. They're doing that. Subvert, infiltrate, attack with this aspiration of world dominance. So maybe an important bit of policy to take from that is you're probably not going to be able to reform it. At some point, it has to collapse, come down, be defeated, be over, or we're going to be living in a very, very grim 21st century world order.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you were there when the British turned over Hong Kong to China, and
Yeah.
we watched kind of a slow motion movie for 20 years or so where Hong Kong, the freest and most free enterprise city in the world, is now under the control of communist China. And, what is your reflection on that?
It's a warning bell that we ought to be paying a lot more attention to. It's kind of dropped from the headlines. When there was tear gas everywhere and reporters could just fly in and out and send reports and pictures, it was all over the news 3 years ago. Now it kind of is there a little bit, but the reason is it's basically behind the bamboo curtain. And the speed with which China moved once they did, we saw the protests, we saw the effort by the horrendous chief executive Carrie Lam to impose something that would allow extradition to China. And then it kind of all faded behind as the virus emerged from Wuhan and everybody became preoccupied with the pandemic. Then on the anniversary of the handover at the end of June in 2020, while everybody was busy with the virus, China wrote in Beijing this and then imposed on Hong Kong this so-called national security law, which is really, you don't want to understand it as a law. It's Communist Party doctrine. It's a set of edicts, and it basically criminalizes anything that the party judges a threat to national security, which can be everything, including colluding with foreigners. So it became very dangerous for people in Hong Kong to talk with anybody abroad if they were talking about anything like democracy, rights, which China had promised for 50 years after the 1997 handover in an international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, deposited with the UN. Xi Jinping just rolled right over that, completely violated it, and then slapped on top of it this Orwellian thing where the slogan that went with the China Deng Xiaoping came up with for the Hong Kong handover was one country, two systems. That's how it was going to be governed. Well, they're still saying we're upholding one country, two systems. Hong Kong at this point has really been stripped of all the rights and freedoms that China had guaranteed for 50 years, roughly halfway through that period, just gone. And instead, the plan now for China's plan, Xi Jinping's plan, is Hong Kong is just one more sort of node in the Belt and Road, is being mulched into what they call the Greater Bay Area, which is China sort of in the Pearl River Delta, and Hong Kong's destiny already being enacted under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, is that from this marvelous freewheeling intersection of Asia, this really world-class, incredible city, it's become a place where there will be very nice amenities. There's a beautiful harbor, a lot of nice apartments. I'm sure that mainlanders, once they start flooding in there after the coronavirus regulations or rules are finally lifted in China, will buy up a lot of real estate. It's a pleasant spot. But it has been gutted of the soul of a great city. It's just that they're destroying it. And it's a reign of terror there. They've used coronavirus rules to terrorize people where you had 2 million people march through the streets in protest in 2019 as they began fearing that they could be extradited to China. Now they can be accused of things under the national security law in Hong Kong, where they will be simply tried in China, if that's what China prefers, jailed, imprisoned in China. There's really no recourse. It's Communist Party rule at their discretion. That's the real bottom line at this point. And they've taken, let me hit a punchline there that's maybe the most important for the rest of the world to understand. I think, at least since the end of World War II, this is the first time that a free society, if not, Hong Kong was not a country. It was officially handed back to China, but as a special enclave, It was a free society. It was a mature free society. They were fully ready to govern ththemselves if they had been given the prerogatives for self-determination that went with all these other foreign colonies after World War II. It was a democracy trying to inhabit institutions that would let it function that way. And this is the first time, I believe, that a tyranny has obliterated that kind of freedom in a free society since World War II. We've had wars, we've had dictatorships, we've had all sorts of things going on. But this was really, the word vibrant does apply. It's overused, but it's because it's true. This was a vibrant free society, and China has destroyed it. It was basically, you know about the case of Jimmy Lai, the newspaper publisher, the businessman who's now in prison, will very likely be in prison for the rest of his life. For what? For championing exactly the democratic rights, the freedoms that China promised Hong Kong would have. And so it was quite a practice run for China, and they've gotten away with it. You know, Hong Kong still functions as their banking window. Financially, they're doing all right. People said for years, oh, China would never kill the golden goose of Hong Kong. They need it. Well, one of the clear messages is that Xi Jinping will sacrifice lots in order to basically get rid of the problem of having that uppity, feisty, freedom-loving, outspoken city of Hong Kong be part of the world system in that way. They're allowed to participate now as a sort of sterile business hub, but it's monstrous, frankly. It's tragic and it's monstrous. That's Hong Kong. That's what they have in mind for Taiwan. And that's the kind of system that they have in mind for this world order that Xi Jinping puts out there as the Chinese dream, which I think is a tremendous insult to actual Chinese people.
So how do you see the issue of compromise, the Biden administration compromised by the tens of millions of dollars they've taken from China? You know, I'm sure you're familiar with Peter Schweizer's work and Miranda Devine, and there's no talk about it in the media, very little about this. And for instance, when Biden abandoned the China initiative that Trump had put in, where we were going after all of their stealing our technology and trade secrets and all that, how is that affecting the current between the two superpowers of the world? What is your take on this?
It's really not a good idea to have millions flowing from the government of China or companies related to the government of China to relatives of a president of the United States, past, present, future, anything like that. It's very troubling. I've not been covering this directly. I don't have the level of detailed knowledge that, say, we've heard from some of the reporters you just mentioned. But what's clear is there's a scene here in which there's reason to be concerned, to ask who might really be compromised. And I see enormous concentration by our authorities right now on questions of domestic politics that, let me say, I feel are, you know, terribly interesting, I'm sure, for the domestic fights that are going on. But there are bigger forces at play in the world than that. And I'm seeing pathetically little attention at this point devoted to them. It's interesting, the head of the FBI, Chris Wray, appeared in London and together with the head of MI5 was talking about China and how many investigations they opened and so on. At the same time, okay, that was a good speech in London. But back here, as you say, they killed the Justice Department China initiative. They're not pursuing these things. You know, the question of what did happen with Hunter Biden's laptop is, again, it becomes this incredible spaghetti of what people are told, many different things. They sort of hard to know what to believe. And it would be very good to feel that we have judicial authorities, an FBI, a Department of Justice, that is above all concerned with protecting our system, with ensuring respect for our laws, and making sure that we are not, in fact, prey to the system of bribery, subversion, corruption, infiltration, and so on. That is how China operates in the world these days. So, yeah, it's extremely troubling. I have the sense sometimes that inside the United States, there's sort of this pinata grab going on over power and plunder. All the fights in Washington, this discussion of we're going to transform the country, which I think the left really is trying to do. And meantime, sort of around the edge of the room, there are big things coming in where we're heading for something like the next Pearl Harbor, only it won't be Pearl Harbor. It will be a 21st century version of it. You get up one morning and the lights don't go on, and it's not because the local power station has a problem. I don't know exactly how it will come. There's lots of wargaming and trying to figure out how would that happen. But I think over and over, we're signaling weakness. We're signaling a preoccupation with things that history will look back on someday and say, boy, those were pretty crazy times. And we're heading into more and more an environment that is similar to the late 1930s, except 21st century engines of destruction. That's sort of the worst place you don't ever want to be in that spot. And that is where we are.
Listen, you've been very generous with your time. Would you mind staying with us a few more minutes? There's a couple other topics I'd like to cover if you've got the time.
Yeah, maybe I can find some way to be a little more upbeat. The difficulty always is it's sort of social convention, polite, and just generally nicer in life to find things that sound good, and to look for something where you end by saying, "But it will be okay." And the problem here is if you actually look at the trajectories, sort of do some of the math, there are things here where unless a very big turnaround comes, it will not be okay. We're banking on some act of the gods, which is not a strategy. And when you see bit by bit, if you sort of measure where the world is today versus where it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, the trajectory is very troubling. But yeah, happy to chat a little more.
So next, I'd like to get back to Russia and Ukraine. And did Biden stumble us into that? I mean, with his talk about sanctions ahead of time and with his energy policy, basically that has resulted in the West financing the Russian war effort far more than we have supported Ukraine, and which has mostly come from the U.S. And while they claim this is tighten NATO, everyone come together, not many of them are putting up much money to support the cause. So, and then cover that with how you see this ending. Is it going to be a negotiated settlement? Is one side going to win? And how will we know? And so I hand that off to you.
Well, thank you. Okay. Look, President Biden invited this. He did it from day one when he killed the Keystone Pipeline. Every time he kills, sort of further strangles the American energy industry, it's another gift to Vladimir Putin and to the Iranians. And it's. I think Vladimir Putin could only read that as good. This is going to work out well for me. And then there's sort of a series of things. The endless announcements that America was going to be able to find common ground on climate with places like China and Russia. No, the promises from them are way out there in the future. Forget it. Even if you think that emissions are terribly important, man-made emissions are a big factor in anything, an assumption that personally I think is rather overrated. But then came the fall of Afghanistan, as we discussed, the retreat of America from Afghanistan, as we discussed. And I think that was a complete green light. And then followed that period of American diplomacy where, with Secretary of State Tony Blinken talking endlessly about off-ramps, the President Biden gaffe where he sort of says he could green light a minor incursion into Ukraine, where Russia had already annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. And, a minor incursion is okay. You never say that. You just never say that. It's not okay. And as the troops built up, basically there was one American official after another from the Biden administration kept saying, well, Russia has a choice, as if they were sort of a naughty child in grade school. You can choose to do better. But you're talking to Vladimir Putin, and actually he's not invincible, and he can be deterred. They didn't. They failed abysmally to deter him, and in he went. And where does this go? Okay, we slow walked the weapons. We didn't do anything with the sanctions until it finally came to it. I don't think sanctions win this anyway. Fine, go with them. They're useful for tracking things and dealing with some egregious cases. They tend to erode. They have a half-life. People find ways around them. We stop enforcing them. I've seen it too many times. But, okay, we're providing more weapons now to Ukraine, but they've been fighting for months. The rules of the game have become, you can't actually attack Russia. It's all got to be one as a defensive game. That makes it very hard to win. The business with the U.S. refusal to allow old MiGs to be flown from Ramstein Air Base to Ukraine when Ukraine asked for them because it might provoke Russia. Anytime you're talking about it might provoke Russia, Russia is self-provoking. They'll be provoked on their own schedule. What you want to do is deter Russia. And we've done rather a bad job of that. Russia is normalizing the idea that they can make open war in Eastern Europe. We're sort of used to it at this point. It's news, but it was shocking in March. Now it's just part of the news. And I worry that while Putin has had big losses, this probably didn't go the way he planned. It's expensive for him as he doubles down to carry on, that it may not remain limited to Ukraine. And I think the thing that's going to come in from left field, except you could see it coming, is while we're all trying to think, how do you have a negotiated settlement? What can you do? And the negotiations, the Biden administration has already given Russia huge leverage by way of the Iran nuclear deal, which has been negotiating for almost a year and a half, sort of continuing on as Russia's assault on Ukraine has been playing out, while the Biden administration has handed Russia the role of one of its go-betweens with the Iranians, who have refused to talk to us directly at these talks. I mean, it's an insane scene. But somewhere in there, my great fear is that China is going to move militarily on Taiwan. And now you have, on two fronts, very big, bad things going on. I don't think the U.S. is ready for that. I don't think we're doing enough to deter it in Asia, not nearly enough. And then you're into a scene where in two very important theaters, you've got conflicts going on. I don't know how that plays out, but I think at that point, look back to the 30s. One thing, another thing. The Japanese invade Manchuria. The Germans Hitler comes to power. The Germans begin to move. One thing, it accumulates. And that's the path that things are on right now. There's no plan to win in Ukraine. The plan is sort of for, try and outlast the Russians, try and degrade it, hope that they just sort of give up and go home, or that you can just last in it, go on for years. I mean, if Afghanistan is the model, it took years and years before the Soviet Union finally left, and then it took, I believe, another 2 years or so before it finally collapsed. It did play into the collapse, but that's a long fuse, and especially in fast-moving times today. So I don't know exactly how this gets settled, but I think as things are currently configured, it's going to get worse. not necessarily right there in Ukraine, but the big picture. I want to find something good to tell you, but that's not it.
So one final topic, the Iran nuke deal that you just mentioned. Why
Yeah.
do you believe the Obama and Biden are so desperate to have this deal? I mean, first of all, if they just go back into it, the window that Iran is barred from having nuclear weapons is down to just 2 or 3 years. And, Biden just this week told the Israeli Prime Minister Lapid that under no circumstances will they allow Iran to have nukes. Well, first of all, do you think Iran has nukes already? And second of all, what is driving Biden so desperately to get into this deal, as if there's, we know one of the results is going to be to give, I don't know, estimates $100 billion in Iran's coffers to create more mischief all over the Middle East and throughout the world and Latin America as well. I mean, what is driving this? And I keep expecting any day to hear that, oh, they've had the breakthrough and now we're going to have the return to, the JCPOA. So what are your thoughts
We
on
could
this one?
finally get that. They're talking about it now, but when they were talking about a breakthrough as imminent back in January, as soon as it became clear that Russia was an important go-between and had sort of leverage via these talks, I thought, oh God, this is going to drag on forever, because Russia likes that position. And they are part of the P5+1 that made the original deal. It was always a deal where you had sitting at the table, along with the US, the Russia and China, who did not have our interests at heart at all. And the logic was sort of, well, you need the big powers at the table. But fine, that worked out to a deal that was never going to stop the bomb. And then when you looked at, I went to Vienna to cover the first 2 rounds of negotiating in 2014 when Wendy Sherman was over there, and now who's now back at state working on the same kinds of issues, and saying inane things to China. But it was quite clear, actually, that deal was not for U.S. purposes about stopping Iran from getting the bomb. That was the official line. The exclusively peaceful nuclear program was what they kept saying. It was about deferring the day Iran would publicly say we've got the bomb until after Obama. And now it seems to be about trying to defer that day until after Biden, or at least till after the midterms, I guess. And we now have the added factor. Why would they want this deal so much? Well, having strangled the U.S. energy industry, they're having problems with gas prices possibly affecting the midterm elections. They want more oil on the world market. And one source of oil is open up the taps for Iran. If they get a deal here, I don't know exactly what the timing would be, but remember, markets work on expectations. If you suddenly know there's going to be a lot more oil coming on the market, you start to see an effect. So they've been going to the Venezuelans, the Saudis, and effectively with this deal, the Iranians, to put more oil there so we can take care of Europe and our gas prices will come down, but don't produce it in the United States, which is so perverse. It's really, I fear that Darwin is involved at this point. I hope not. As I said, America's a great country. We deserve better. But I think that's a big part of it. There may also just be incredible folly among diplomats at the State Department. There's a history of that. But I think it's being driven in substantial part by there is a real problem with Iran. Do they have the bomb? I have no proof. But look, we've been told for years and years, they're 6 months from the bomb, they're 2 months from the bomb, they're a week from the bomb, they're a year from the bomb. And they, meantime, have been building the centrifuges, enriching uranium. They deal with North Korea. Remember, 10 years ago, everyone was worried they would buy a bomb from North Korea. I don't see why everyone's less worried about that today. Kim Jong-un is more strapped and is busy digging new test sites at Punggye-ri after he blew them up when Trump was trying to talk to him. And North Korea is, I think, credibly believed to have a nuclear arsenal. I still worry about those old things we used to worry about as well as the new. So, does Iran have a bomb? I don't know, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out.
Right.
And the thing that's clear is this is not going to stop them from getting a bomb. We've done nothing to really deter them. And uh, the appetite, the sort of strangely selective appetite for oil, depending on where it's produced from the Biden administration, is a terrible disservice, not only to Americans at the gas pump, but to national security.
Well, Claudia, you've been so generous with your time here today and incredibly
Thank you.
enlightening. And tell us so our viewers can follow you on social media, if where they can see most of your writings, and any final words, anything you want to, any books or anything you want to tell us about, please. Where can they
Yeah.
read more about you? Yeah.
I'm going to be really unfashionable. Instead of recommending a book that's just out, I'm going to say go back and read C.S. Lewis on the Screwtape Letters. The Screwtape Letters, the letters from an older devil to a younger on how to corrupt the heart of man. So I've been telling you all these depressing things about where the world is going. And the younger devil at one point, right, says to the older devil, well, World War II has broken out. Surely there must be real evil we can go to town on now. And the older devil says, be careful. It's sometimes in these moments of extremity that you see the most heroic moral acts done, that people rise to the occasion. So I would say reread the Screwtape Letters and consider how to rise to the occasion, because people can matter. It does matter to have a voice. It does matter to say the right thing. It does matter to say the emperor has no clothes. It does matter to say we need to do something. We need to, above all, we need to build up our military right now. Let me just give you that as a bottom line. There are many good books out, but I love reading many of our best thinkers. I enjoy the works of Victor Davis Hanson. I love good poetry. There's much to that. Go back and read Shakespeare. He wrote about problems of how you handle states that are in trouble.
Well, how about if they want to read more of your work, and where would they find that? And
Okay,
I guess you have social media? Are you
yeah,
on?
you can find that at iwf.org,
Okay.
which is the website for the Independent Women's Forum with which I'm affiliated. And I write for a number of places, but it sort of depends on time and topic. I contribute from time to time to the Wall Street Journal, to the New York Sun, I blog for Pajamas Media. IWF is where you'll find it all in one place. And
Okay. Great.
I guess I really just do want to say, I know social media drives so much. Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I use it mostly for research. It's not research that I rely on to see what people are fighting
Right.
about. It's a dreadful
Uh-huh.
medium. I use it to follow the Chinese government officials, where I actually think they shouldn't be on Twitter at all, because they flood it with lies and propaganda. But while they're there, but I read lies and propaganda for a living, so why not? But no, I would actually say, by all means, go to important websites that will tell you things that make sense. But also go back to the great books. We're losing our history. We're losing the things where, generations thought, labored to produce great works that would tell you something about the world. Go back and read them. So that's my unfashionable advice. And Roger, it's really been a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been great. And I think this is the third time we've done this. Where I've gotten to interview you, and it's always enlightening, fantastic. And I thank you for spending this hour with us, and we'll stay in touch. Okay. Thank you very
Yes, I
much.
hope when we next talk, there's better news. Take care, Roger.
Okay. Thank you, Claudia. Claudia Rosett has been our guest today, and I want to thank you. And we will be back next week with another conversation, another great guest. And till then, have a great week. Thank you.